In Blackridge Prison, the inmates were used to violence. Broken jaws, smuggled blades, men who killed without blinking. None of that surprised them anymore. What shocked the whole block was a police K-9 growling at the wrong man. Not a murderer, not a gang enforcer, but the one inmate who smiled when the others stepped away. A man built like a fighter, who looked at the officer like he already knew his fate. Viper didn't bark. He stared, as if he smelled something crawling beneath the skin. Something not even killers dared to touch. Subscribe if you believe some heroes don't chase glory. They just stand their ground, protect silently, and bite only when the sun hung low over the prison yard, throwing dry light across concrete and steel. Heat pressed against the ground, humming faintly like a warning no one cared to hear. Blackridge State Prison looked older than it should have, as if time itself refused to touch it. Rusted fences leaned into the wind like tired men. The guard towers kept watch with the stillness of hunters that knew patience. Officer Darren Locke stepped from the patrol truck with his K-9 partner Viper at his heel. Darren, 39, wore his Navy K-9 unit polo as if it were a second skin, neat, plain, meant for work, not show. His build was disciplined, sturdy, sun-darkened from long training hours outside. Viper, a brown-black German shepherd with a thick working dog frame, moved beside him with quiet certainty, sniff in the air like someone reading bad news in the wind. A voice greeted them before they reached the entrance. "What brings you here, Officer Locke?" Warden Barton, heavy-set and mid-40s, waited with a firm but unwelcoming stance. His olive uniform was clean but worn at the edges, like it once mattered to him to look proper, and now only helped him hide in plain sight. His hair, thinning and combed flat, gave him a polite appearance that didn't match his tired, pale skin. His handshake was strong, too strong, as if strength were all he had left to prove. He smiled with the kind of smile that arrives late and leaves early. "This place doesn't need lectures about law," he said softly. "We make our own rules here." Darren stood still a moment longer than necessary. He caught the faint scent clinging to Barton's fingers, a chemical note that reminded him of fentanyl labs he had helped raid years ago. The odor was sharp, invasive, something that didn't belong on a man who claimed order was his only business. Beside him, Viper let out a short huff through his nose. Not a growl, not a warning, just acknowledgement. Dogs don't understand corruption, Darren thought, but they understand danger. He remained quiet, letting the silence speak more clearly than any accusation. Barton's smile tightened, as if he expected something else and was disappointed to receive nothing at all. As they passed through the steel doors, the lock clanged behind them with a heavy finality. Blackridge swallowed the sound, leaving only echo and dust. Darren walked lightly, not out of fear, but out of caution born from experience. He had seen men who ruled with violence, and men who ruled by letting violence do the work for them. Barton struck him as the second kind. In the hallway, fluorescent lights hummed overhead like bees trapped in glass. A few guards nodded without emotion, routine greetings, empty, rehearsed. None asked why he had come, and that was the most telling detail of all. A place that isn't curious is a place that already knows too much. Vipers. The cafeteria buzzed beneath harsh fluorescent light, its air thick with heat, metal trays, and the faint smell of restless bodies. Darren stepped through the doorway with Viper at his heel, the dog's brown-black fur catching a dull reflection from the lamps above. The room didn't go silent because of him. It went silent because every inmate turned their attention to someone else walking toward him. Troy Maddox, a towering man in a worn gray tank top, built like a memory of street fights and bad decisions. Tattoos crept from his shoulders to his neck like old stories no one should have heard. His steps were slow, confident, dragging a hush across the tables. He smiled as he approached, a crooked smile that didn't bother hiding its pride. "So you're the cop they sent," he said, voice thick, half amused. "What's that dog good for? Barking when you're scared." His words were soaked in teasing, but his tone held a kind of test, as if he needed to prove this room still belonged to him. The prison's laughter rose like cheap smoke. Yet Viper didn't bark. He didn't growl. His body lowered just slightly, a steady, trained stance. Muscles tightened beneath his fur like coiled rope. His nose twitched once, then again, as if reading something no one else could smell. Darren didn't pull the leash tighter. He knew when his partner was thinking. Instead of threat, the dog showed recognition, a kind of certainty that felt older than violence. Viper's jaw clenched gently, teeth barely visible, but his focus never wavered. He wasn't reacting to a man who wanted a fight. He was reacting to something that clung to Troy's clothes, something sharp, bitter, like the ghost of a chemical lab. Fentanyl. Darren knew the scent only because he had lived alongside raids, seized shipments, and long nights spent cataloging powders that ruined families like spills that couldn't be mopped clean. Troy's grin faltered, just a flicker. But in a place like Blackridge, even a flicker could topple a throne. Confidence drained from his posture, not enough for others to name it, but enough for his body to step an inch away from the dog. That single step echoed louder than a punch ever could. The inmates watched with curiosity, confusion, maybe even doubt. They had always believed Troy was unbeatable, a man feared for what he had done. But a dog had read him without words, without hesitation, without fear. Darren stayed silent, offering no challenge, no insult. He let the moment unfold gently, without force. Silence carried its own authority, and silence made Troy's retreat feel heavier. The clatter of trays resumed slowly, like rain beginning after a long drought. But no one laughed now. Respect didn't shift to Darren, not yet. It shifted away from Troy, and that was far more dangerous. Sometimes truth doesn't shout, it just breathes, and those who smell it cannot pretend they didn't. Night pressed against the small infirmary window, warm and heavy, as if the darkness itself were holding its breath. The room smelled of antiseptic, sharp, bitter, clinging to the walls like secrets no one wanted to speak aloud. Darren knelt on the cold tile floor, with Viper's body cradled gently between his knees. The dog's brown-black fur trembled with violent shivers, foam gathering at the edges of his mouth. The nurse on duty had left minutes earlier, offering little more than confusion and a shrug. Darren didn't blame her. She was used to treating wounds born of anger, not poison. He injected the antidote with practiced steadiness, his hands calm not because he wasn't afraid, but because fear can't be allowed to shake the one who holds a life. A thin lamp hummed above them, and its glow felt too bright, too harsh. "Easy, boy," he whispered. The words came out more like a plea than encouragement. The door opened without a knock. Warden Barton stepped inside, shoulders wide. The fabric of his olive shirt stretched from years of being fitted to authority rather than honesty. He spoke in a voice that was low, careful, sounding almost bored. "You're making too much fuss, Locke. Dogs get sick." Darren didn't rise. He simply looked at Barton's shoes, polished but fraying at the edges, and the heavy key belt slung at his waist. "His food was tampered with," Darren said. It wasn't anger, just truth spoken plainly. "I need the camera footage from the kennels." Barton let out a slow sigh, shaking his head like a disappointed parent. "We don't install cameras for animals. We save them for humans." He smirked, the kind of smirk that believed rules were things you could bend if you wrote them yourself. Then he left, closing the door softly, as though violence should always be quiet. Hours later, the night deepened. Viper's breathing steadied, ragged but stubborn. His eyes, though heavy, remained open. He stared not at Darren, but at the door where Barton had stood, as if something, or someone, might return. Darren stroked the dog's fur, letting his thumb rest on the warm patch near the spine, the way he had after long days of training outside, when the world felt simple and laws still meant something. He remembered raids in dusty warehouses, chemical burn on his hands, the ache in his bones after carrying boxes of evidence that could ruin entire neighborhoods. He knew the smell on Troy's clothes. He knew the bitterness clinging to Barton's fingers. And now, this, ketamine mixed with stolen medicine, a dose meant to silence, not kill outright. "Whoever tried," Darren murmured, voice barely a breath. "They were aiming at you to get to me." Viper blinked once, slow, deliberate. The loyalty was mutual. In that quiet room, with only the hum of the lamp and the warmth of a wounded animal, Darren felt something settle inside him. Not anger, but resolve. Justice isn't loud, it waits. And, tonight, it waited with a dog who refused to close his eyes. Sunlight flooded the yard with a dry, burning glare, as if the heat itself was watching. The prisoners gathered slowly at first, then all at once, drawn by something they couldn't yet name. Darren stood with Viper beside him, the dog's brown-black fur glowing faintly under the sun. Viper hadn't fully recovered, but there he was, steady on his paws, tail low, waiting like a quiet witness. Darren watched the inmates mill around the concrete field. He knew they weren't here for exercise. They were here for a show. The air felt crowded with unseen tension, as if every heartbeat in the yard belonged to someone waiting to see blood. Darren wasn't afraid. Fear wasn't loud for him anymore. It was a quiet thing, shaped more like patience than panic. Troy Maddox stepped into the yard with the practiced gait of a man who wants everyone to see him. His gray tank top clung to his body like a badge of dominance, sweat creeping down thick muscles built from fights instead of training. His shaved head gleamed under the sun, and along his neck, a tattoo curled like a snake ready to strike. In his hand, he held a plastic shank, whittled sharp, cruel in its simplicity. He didn't hide it. He didn't need to. "Let's see you move without the dog," he said, voice grinding like sandpaper in pride. Darren felt the words land, not as a threat, but as an invitation. Yet he remembered the rule. If an officer struck first, suspension followed. The law here was twisted, weaponized to protect the ones who broke it. So Darren stepped aside, avoiding each lunge with calm, economical motions. Nothing wasted, nothing given. Viper didn't bark. He didn't growl. He watched, his stance low, his body tense but patient. Troy slashed again, then again, aiming not to scare, but to mark flesh. The inmates leaned forward, hungry for the spectacle. The blade sliced the air close enough for Darren to feel it, but still he held his ground, answering only with movement, not force. In that suspended moment, Viper shifted his weight. Darren saw it from the corner of his eye, the readiness, the decision forming. Troy twisted his wrist to stab again, overconfident, swinging too wide, and that was enough. Viper exploded from stillness into precision. No roar, no fury, just training meeting purpose. His jaws clamped down on Troy's wrist. Firm, exact, not tearing, not maiming, only holding. The shank dropped. Troy screamed, not from the pain, but from humiliation. A man who ruled with violence, undone by an animal who chose restraint. The yard fell silent, carried by shock. Not at the force, but at the control. Darren placed his hand calmly on Viper's back, grounding both of them. Justice, he thought, doesn't always punish. Sometimes it simply refuses to let harm continue. And in that silence, a truth settled across the yard like shade. No man owns fear forever. Rain began to spit against the windows that night, tapping lightly, like a warning no one wanted to hear. Darren walked the corridor alone beside Viper, the dog trotting with a quiet readiness, still favoring the shoulder that took Troy's blade. The hallway smelled of bleach and steel, thick as if the air itself held secrets. Darren slowed his steps when he saw two figures near the operations office. Under a yellow, half-burned light, Warden Barton stood face to face with Troy Maddox. They didn't speak loudly. They didn't need to. Their hands met in a slow, deliberate handshake, a gesture heavy with something older than friendship, agreement. Barton's gray uniform looked sharper than usual, too clean for a place that stank of sweat and confinement. At his boots, a gym bag lay half unzipped, white powder spilling, quickly nudged away with a polished toe. Darren felt a coldness that didn't come from the rain. Trust, he thought, can die without anyone raising a voice. The prison yard grew restless in the days that followed. Homemade blades appeared in places they shouldn't. Metal spoons were sharpened. Words were passed only in glances. Darren sensed the change in rhythm, violence preparing itself like a storm, gathering beyond sight. Viper sensed it too, nose lifting as if tracking danger in the air. At meals, inmates stopped staring at Darren with curiosity. Now their eyes held direction. Someone had instructed them. Someone had chosen the target. Darren looked at Troy across the room. The man no longer tried to provoke him. That silence, that sudden calm, was more threatening than any insult. Darren remembered his training. The most dangerous strike comes from someone who stops trying to win approval and starts waiting for permission. He returned to his quarters quietly, Viper curling near his feet, breath slow but alert. The dog's fur still carried the faint scent of antiseptic from the infirmary. Darren sat on the metal bunk, listening to the rain deepen, each drop sounding heavier, as if it landed with intention. He opened his duffel bag and sifted through gear until he found a small device, black, barely bigger than a gum wrapper. A GoPro for K9 work, built for close quarters. Light, durable, unassuming. The kind of witness no one questions. Viper lifted his head as Darren approached and stood still while the tiny camera was fastened to his collar. Darren stroked the dog's neck once, slow and steady, like a vow made without words. If they were to be attacked, they would not fight for victory. They would fight to preserve the truth. He whispered, not to Viper, not to himself, but to the room that held every secret. You don't stop corruption by talking. You stop it by letting it speak for itself. A late sun turned the windows orange, stretching long shadows across the floor, like thin, silent warnings. Darren was called to the evidence warehouse, a forgotten space at the back of Blackridge, where dust collected on crates the way unfinished stories collect in old men's memories. The air smelled of cardboard and stale chemicals, the kind used to mask something far more dangerous. The corridor leading there was empty, too quiet for a prison at this hour. Viper walked beside him, steady and cautious, his shoulder still marked with a healing scrape beneath the fur. The heavy door clanged shut behind them, and the lights flickered once before dying. A darkness settled, not chaotic, but prepared. It felt like a decision someone had already made. Darren stood still long enough to hear the distant hum of the ventilation, the only witness to what would happen next. When the lights snapped back on, a ring of inmates surrounded him. Troy Maddox led them, holding a pipe carved down to a brutal edge. His breath was slow, purposeful, like a man walking toward a resolution he'd already accepted. No guards came, no alarms sounded. Darren understood then. This wasn't an attack of anger. It was a ceremony, approved and arranged. The inmates rushed, clumsy but desperate. Darren didn't strike back to punish. He moved to survive. Arm locks, wrist turns, bodies become shields. His duty wasn't to defeat men, but to keep harm from spreading. Viper worked like memory itself, without rage, only precision, snapping at wrists and ankles, removing the ability to injure rather than the right to exist. Their movements were a language, something old and instinctive between handler and dog. Yet through the noise, something else spoke louder, a thud from a falling crate. Its lid splintered, spilling white powder across the floor, coating Troy's shoe like ash. Troy saw the powder, then the small camera on Viper's collar, and a moment of fear cracked through his confidence. He lunged, roaring more from panic than power, swinging the pipe toward Darren's head as if he could destroy the evidence by destroying the witness. Viper leapt first. His body struck the blow meant for Darren, a sharp yelp, then silence. That silence broke something inside Darren, not anger, but a clarity so steady it felt like grief. He moved with calm strength, wrapping Troy's arm, pulling him down, applying a choke that was meant to end only his defiance, not his life. Breath stopped, then returned. The pipe clattered away. The warehouse was still again, save for Viper's strained breathing. Darren knelt, steadying the dog with both hands, whispering without anger or triumph, only truth. No one survives this by force. We survive by telling what others fear to hear. The camera kept recording, blinking its quiet light. The morning came with a pale sun that did not warm the halls, leaving the prison quiet as a church before service. Darren walked through Blackridge the way one walks through a dream that has already turned sour. The noise was wrong, too low, too controlled. A guard, younger than most, with freckles and a voice that tried too hard to sound firm, whispered as Darren passed, "Inmate in solitary, hung himself." The boy spoke the way someone repeats what they were ordered to say. Darren didn't answer. He only felt the news settle inside him like a familiar ache. The dead man had been part of Troy Maddox's circle, a lean figure who once shouted louder than he fought. Now he was gone, and the silence around his death felt polished, like steel scrubbed clean. Viper padded beside him, the dog's pace slow but alert, nostrils flaring as if catching the scent of something rotten beneath fresh disinfectant. They opened the door to solitary, a body swayed slightly from a rope tied too neatly to have been done in fear. The inmate's wrists bore faint marks, bruises not from struggle, but from being held. His face showed no panic, only resignation. Darren saw it before anyone spoke. This man didn't choose death. He was assigned it. A lieutenant tried to sound sympathetic, saying the inmate had problems. Darren looked at the knots, the placement of the rope, the bruising. Everything spoke of someone who died, not because he wanted to, but because he knew something. Barton had cut ties the way drug dealers cut off witnesses, with efficiency mistaken for control. The lieutenant moved on quickly, eager to bring normalcy back to a place that had never truly known it. Darren didn't stop him. He didn't accuse. He simply listened to the silence the way a doctor listens to a dying heartbeat, not to save it, but to understand it. Later, in a small office lit by a single dusty window, Darren connected a device and transferred footage. Viper lay at his feet, shoulder wrapped with fresh bandaging, breathing slow but calm. The GoPro had recorded more than the ambush. It had captured Barton's voice, low and smooth, giving Troy keys, a modified shank, and a bag of powder sealed like a promise. It captured the tone of a man who thought corruption made him untouchable. Darren sent the file to the state police without ceremony. There was no speech, no righteous fury, just the click of a mouse and the quiet decision to let truth travel beyond these walls. Hours later, officers in crisp blue uniforms entered Blackridge, not rushing, not shouting, only doing their job. Barton was taken through the administrative hall, handcuffed, his face pale, his lips tight. He tried to meet Darren's eyes. Darren simply placed his hand gently on Viper's back, feeling the slow rhythm of the dog's breath, steady and alive. It wasn't triumph he felt, only relief, soft and simple, like air finally leaving a sealed room. Autumn sunlight drifted gently across the training field, warm and quiet, as if the world wanted to forget what had happened. Weeks later, Blackridge looked different. The heavy tension that once clung to the air had thinned, replaced by a cautious calm, like grass trying to grow again after fire. Troy Maddox had been transferred to a federal facility, shackled but strangely silent, like a man who finally understood the cost of his own pride. Several officers were dismissed, hands trembling as they signed paperwork that ended their careers. The new warden, a woman in her early 60s with silver hair cut short and a steady gaze, brought an air of stern forgiveness. She spoke little, but ordered the evidence room renovated first, as though justice begins in the place where truth is hidden. Darren saw in her a quiet strength, the kind that doesn't need to be loud to matter. Viper walked at his side, his wounded shoulder still wrapped, yet his stride sure, neither limping nor boasting, just working. The ceremony was held outdoors, near the flagpole, where guards stood, not as enforcers, but as witnesses. A long table held certificates, badges, and a single small medal shaped like a shield. Officers from nearby counties attended, polished shoes in neat lines, hands folded. There were cameras too, their lenses shining like curious eyes trying to understand bravery. Viper stood calmly among them, tail still, breath even, brown fur moving with the wind. A veterinarian knelt beside the dog, a middle-aged woman with kind wrinkles and a soft, steady voice. She checked his bandaging and whispered something to him, her tone like a prayer meant only for animals. Darren felt a quiet gratitude, the kind he used to think was only found in families. They called his name, they called Viper's. Applause rose, not for violence, not for victory, but for perseverance. Not every battle ends with blood. Some end with witnesses who finally see. Darren was handed a microphone, its cold metal heavy in his palm. People expected a speech, something triumphant or stirring, something to honor sacrifice. He looked at the rows of uniforms, the sunlight glinting off badges, the gentle rustle of flags. His gaze fell on Viper, who simply sat, eyes alert and calm, waiting not for praise, but for the next task. And Darren understood that courage isn't loud, truth doesn't shout. Loyalty has no need for rhetoric, so he lowered the microphone. Instead, he placed his hand on the dog's head, slow and reverent, as if acknowledging an old partner rather than a subordinate. "He doesn't need words," Darren said quietly. "He only needs to choose the right moment to bite." There was a pause, long, respectful, almost sacred. Then the applause came, rising like a wave of relief, gratitude, and something softer. Viper didn't bark, didn't react. He simply stayed close, unwavering, like a shadow that protects rather than follows. The wind lifted the flag. The sunlight held, steady. And Darren realized some victories are not felt in triumph, but in peace, returning to a place where fear once lived. When justice feels messy, when the world looks loud and broken, remember this. True courage often speaks without words. It stands quietly, like a loyal partner at your side, ready to protect even when no one applauds. Officer Darren and Viper taught us that you don't need power to do what's right, only honesty, patience, and a heart that refuses to walk away. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to believe that loyalty still wins and goodness still fights back. Leave a comment, Tell us where you're watching from and subscribe to join our family of listeners.